The morning started like any other morning for Jake Sullivan. He woke up in his small quarters on the museum station, made coffee in the tiny kitchen, and stood by the window to watch the sun rise over Earth. From up here in orbit, the planet looked peaceful and beautiful. Blue oceans, white clouds, and green continents all swirled together in a pattern he never got tired of seeing. Jake was 67 years old now. His hair had turned gray years ago, and his face showed all the lines and wrinkles of a man who had lived a full life. He had spent 40 years in the military before retiring to run this place. The Heritage Fleet Museum was his dream project, something he had worked on for the last 15 years of his life. He finished his coffee and headed to the main observation deck. This was his favorite part of the station, a huge room with windows that looked out at the collection. 23 warships floated in space around the station, each one held in place by tether beams and positioned so visitors could see them clearly. These ships were old, some of them very old, but Jake thought they were the most beautiful things he had ever seen. The oldest ship in the collection was called the Victory. She was a frigate that had been built almost 80 years ago, back when humans were first learning how to fight in deep space. Her hull was painted in the old style, white and gray with red markings along her sides. She was small compared to the other ships, but she had fought in more battles than any of them. Jake always made sure she was positioned right at the front of the collection where everyone could see her first. Next to the Victory was the carrier Independence. She was massive, 10 times bigger than the little frigate. The Independence had launched fighter planes during the Titan Rebellion 70 years ago. Jake remembered reading about that war when he was a kid. The rebels had tried to break away from Earth and form their own government on the moons of Saturn. The Independence and her fighter wings had stopped them. Now she floated here quietly, her launch bays empty and dark. Behind the carrier was the battleship Montana. She was built like a fortress with armor plating so thick that it made her look blocky and crude compared to modern ships. But that armor had saved her crew dozens of times. The Montana had taken hits that would have destroyed lighter ships and kept on fighting. Jake loved her for that stubbornness, that refusal to give up. There were destroyers and cruisers and support ships, each one with its own story, its own history of battles won and lost. Jake knew every story by heart. He had spent years researching these ships, tracking down old crew members to interview them, reading combat reports and maintenance logs. He wanted the museum to be perfect, to honor these ships the way they deserved. A voice called out behind him. It was Lauren Burke, his assistant. She was 26 years old, fresh out of university with a degree in military history. She had bright eyes and endless energy, always eager to learn more about the ships. Jake had hired her 2 years ago, and she had turned out to be the best decision he had made in a long time. Lauren was carrying a tablet computer and looking worried. That was unusual. Lauren almost never looked worried. She walked up to Jake and held out the tablet so he could see the screen. "Something strange is happening with the ships," she said. The maintenance crews ran their morning checks and found power readings coming from some of the reactor cores. Jake frowned and took the tablet from her. He looked at the numbers on the screen. She was right. 7 ships were showing small but steady power outputs from their main reactors. That should not be possible. When a ship was decommissioned and brought to the museum, the first thing they did was drain all the fuel from the reactor cores. Without fuel, the reactors could not produce power. They should be completely dead. "Which ships?" he asked. Lauren pointed to the list on the screen. The Independence, the Montana, the destroyers Hartford and Phoenix, the cruisers Seattle and Denver, and the Victory. Jake stared at the names. Those were some of the most important ships in the collection, the ones with the most distinguished combat records. It had to be a sensor error. There was no other explanation that made sense. "Run a full diagnostic on all the sensors," he said. "Check every ship individually. This has to be a malfunction." Lauren nodded and started typing on her tablet. Before she could finish, alarm bells started ringing throughout the station. Red lights began flashing on the walls. Jake felt his heart jump. He had been in the military long enough to know what that sound meant. It was the emergency alert, the one that only went off when there was a serious threat. A voice came over the intercom system. It was Danny Park, the young man who ran the communications center. His voice was shaking with fear or excitement or both. "Captain Sullivan, you need to get to the command center right now. We have unknown ships entering the solar system. A lot of them. They are coming fast and broadcasting messages on all frequencies." Jake started running. His old legs protested, but he ignored the pain. Lauren ran beside him, still clutching her tablet. They reached the command center in less than 2 minutes. The room was small but packed with screens and computers. Danny was sitting at his station, his fingers flying over the keyboard. 3 other crew members were there too, all of them looking scared. "Show me," Jake said. Danny pulled up the long-range sensors on the main screen. Jake felt his blood turn cold. There were dozens of ships out there, maybe 50 or more. They had appeared at the edge of the solar system and were heading straight for Earth. The computer was analyzing their design and comparing them to known ship types. The analysis came back. These were Varjesh ships. Jake knew about the Varjesh. Everyone did. They were an alien race that had been expanding aggressively through space for the past 10 years. They conquered other species and absorbed them into something they called the Collective. Dozens of planets had fallen to them, but they had never come to Earth before. Earth was supposed to be too strong, too well defended. "Play the message," Jake said quietly. Danny pressed a button and the speakers crackled to life. The voice that came through was harsh and clicking, filtered through a translation computer that made it sound flat and emotionless. "Humans of Earth. This is War Master Krell of the Varjesh Collective. Your solar system has been chosen for integration into the Collective. We have studied your species carefully. You are weak, you live in the past, you build monuments to dead machines and worship the memories of battles long over. We have seen your museum in orbit, old warships that you keep like toys. This tells us everything we need to know about you. You cannot fight. You can only remember when you used to fight. You will surrender your planet within 1 of your hours, or we will take it by force. Resistance is pointless." The message ended. The command center was silent. Jake felt anger rising in his chest, hot and fierce. They thought the museum was a sign of weakness. They thought humans kept these ships because they were afraid to let go of the past. They had no idea what they were looking at. Lauren broke the silence. "What do we do?" she asked. Before Jake could answer, the communication board lit up with an incoming call from Earth. Danny opened the channel and a face appeared on the screen. It was Admiral Victor Carter, the head of Earth Defense Command. Victor was an old friend. He and Jake had served together decades ago. Victor looked tired and grim. "Jake," he said, "I assume you heard the Varjesh message." Jake nodded. "Hard to miss. We have a problem. Earth Defense has 12 active warships in the system right now. The rest of the fleet is scattered across the colonies or in maintenance yards. The Varjesh have 47 battle cruisers. We are badly outnumbered." Jake felt the weight of those numbers settle on his shoulders. 12 against 47. Those were terrible odds. Even with superior training and tactics, Earth Defense would struggle to hold off an attack like that. Victor continued, "We need every ship we can get. Jake, I need to tell you something. Something that has been kept secret for the past 3 years. Your museum ships are not actually decommissioned." Jake stared at the screen. "What are you talking about?" 3 years ago, I authorized a classified project called Operation Inheritance. We never fully decommissioned those ships, Jake. We made it look like we did, but we kept them ready for combat. We installed special fuel cells in the reactor cores, tiny capsules that would slowly release fuel when triggered by certain conditions. We left the AI cores active but in deep hibernation. We kept the weapons systems functional. Everything looks dead from the outside, but those ships can be brought back to full combat status in less than an hour. Jake felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. "You turned my museum into a weapons depot. You lied to me." Victor did not look away. "Yes, I did, and I would do it again. Jake, think about it. We're better to hide a reserve fleet than in plain sight. The Varjesh looked at your museum and saw exactly what we wanted them to see. Weakness. Nostalgia. A species too attached to its past to build a proper future. But that is not what those ships represent. They represent every lesson we ever learned about warfare, every tactic we ever developed, every mistake we ever made and learned from. Each ship in your collection was retired because we built something better, but that does not mean they cannot still fight." Jake looked at Lauren. She was staring at him with wide eyes. He looked back at Victor on the screen. "Those power readings Lauren found," Jake said slowly. "The reactors are already starting to activate." "Exactly. The fuel cells detected the Vargesh threat and began the activation sequence automatically. The ships are waking up, Jake, and I need you to command them, me. I have been retired for 15 years. You know those ships better than anyone alive. You know their histories, their capabilities, their strengths and weaknesses. Most of them have AI cores that can handle the basic operations, but they need human command and oversight. Jake, I am reactivating your commission. You are now Captain Sullivan again, commander of Battle Group Heritage." Jake stood there for a long moment, his mind racing. He thought about the ships floating outside the station. He had spent years learning everything about them, treating them like historical artifacts. Now he was being told they were weapons again. Part of him was angry at the deception. But another part, the part that had spent 4 decades in uniform, understood why Victor had done it. Finally, he nodded. "All right. What do you need me to do? Get those ships ready for combat. You have 3 hours before the Vargesh reach Earth orbit. Earth defense will engage them from the front. You hit them from the side with everything you have got. Show them what happens when they underestimate humanity." The screen went dark. Jake stood there for a moment, then turned to his crew. They were all watching him, waiting for orders. "Danny, get me a secure channel to every ship in the collection. Lauren, pull up the activation protocols. I need to know how to bring these ships online." Everyone started moving. Lauren was typing frantically on her tablet, pulling up files that had been hidden in the station computers. Jake watched through the windows as the ships outside began to change. Running lights flickered on along their hulls. Weapons turrets that had been locked in place for years started to rotate and track. The ships looked the same from the outside, but something fundamental had changed. They were no longer exhibits. They were warships again. The Independence was the first to fully activate. Her massive hull lit up as her reactor came to full power. Jake could see fighter craft moving in her launch bays, automated systems preparing them for deployment. The carrier had not launched fighters in 70 years, but she remembered how to do it. Next was the Montana. The old battleship powered up more slowly, her ancient systems taking time to warm up. But when her main batteries came online, Jake felt a chill run down his spine. Those guns had been designed to crack open asteroid fortresses. They could do terrible damage to the Vargesh ships. One by one, the other ships woke up. The cruisers Seattle and Denver, the destroyers Hartford and Phoenix, support ships and patrol boats, and finally the little frigate Victory, oldest of them all, her systems coming online with a speed that suggested she had been waiting for this moment. Lauren handed Jake a headset. "The communication channels are open. All ships are responding." Jake put on the headset and took a deep breath. "This is Captain Jake Sullivan to all ships of Battle Group Heritage. I know this is unexpected. Most of you have been sleeping for a long time, but Earth needs you now. Enemy forces are approaching and they think you are just old relics. They think you cannot fight anymore. Let us prove them wrong." One by one, the AI cores responded. Their voices were different, each one unique based on the programmers who had created them decades ago. Some sounded young and eager. Others sounded old and tired, but all of them were ready. The Independence spoke first. Her AI had a calm, professional tone. Independence ready for combat operations. "All fighter wings are prepared for launch." "Good to be back, Captain." The Montana rumbled in next, her AI sounding like an old veteran. Montana reporting. "Weapons systems at full capacity. Shields are charging. Someone needs a reminder about how we used to do things." The other ships checked in one after another. Jake listened to each report and felt something stirring in his chest. These ships were more than just metal and circuits. They had personalities, histories, pride. They were ready to fight again. The last to report was the Victory. Her AI had a young voice, which seemed strange for such an old ship. But Jake remembered reading that her AI had been upgraded several times during her long service. "Victory here, Captain. All systems operational. I have been waiting a long time for this. Let us show these newcomers what the old guard can do." Jake smiled. He could not help it. "All right, people. Here is what we are going to do. The Vargesh think we are weak because we keep old ships. They do not understand that each of you represents lessons learned in blood and fire. You were built in different eras, faced different enemies, solved different problems. That diversity is our strength. The Varjesh have studied our recent battles, but they have not studied you. Lauren pulled up a tactical display showing the Varjesh fleet. Jake studied it carefully. 47 ships moving in a tight formation. They were confident, maybe overconfident. That could be used against them. Independence, you will command the fighter wings. I want them ready to launch on my signal. Montana, you are the anchor. Position yourself at the center of our formation. Everyone else form up around the Montana. We are going to use a defensive pattern called Sierra. It is old, probably before most of the Varjesh commanders were even born. Lauren, find me the combat records for that pattern. Lauren was already searching. Found it. Sierra pattern was developed during the Mars conflict 60 years ago. It uses overlapping shields and coordinated fire to create a defensive wall that is very hard to break through. Perfect. All ships execute formation Sierra. We have 3 hours before the Varjesh arrive. Use that time to run diagnostics and prepare for combat. This is going to be the fight of our lives. The ships began to move. It was beautiful to watch. These vessels had not flown in formation for decades, but their AI cores remembered. They slid into position with practiced ease, creating a defensive line that looked almost ceremonial in its precision. Jake felt Lauren standing beside him. She was watching the ships with awe on her face. "I cannot believe this is real," she said quietly. "I thought I was just working in a museum. Now we are going to war." Jake put a hand on her shoulder. "You are going to be my tactical officer. I need you to stay here at the command center and coordinate information between all the ships. Can you do that?" She looked at him with frightened eyes, but she nodded. "Yes, Captain, I can do it." "Good. Danny, you and the rest of the crew will stay here too. Keep the station safe and maintain communications. I am transferring over to the Independence. That is where I need to be." Jake left the command center and headed for the docking bay. There was a small shuttle there that could take him to the carrier. He had not been on a warship in 15 years, but as he walked through the corridors of the station, he felt the old training coming back. The way he carried himself changed. His stride became more purposeful. His mind shifted into combat mode, analyzing threats and planning responses. The shuttle ride to the Independence took 10 minutes. As he approached the massive carrier, Jake marveled at her size. She was over 1 kilometer long, with launch bays that could hold hundreds of fighters. Her hull was scarred and dented from decades of combat, but someone had kept her in perfect condition. Every system was functioning. Every light was on. The shuttle docked and Jake stepped onto the carrier's bridge. It was exactly as he remembered from the historical records. A large circular room with stations for different crew positions, screens showing tactical information, windows looking out at space. But there were no human crew members here, only the AI. "Welcome aboard, Captain," the Independence said. Her voice came from speakers all around the room. "It is good to have a human commander again. I have missed that." Jake sat down in the captain's chair. It felt right, like putting on an old coat that still fit perfectly. Status report. All systems are functioning at 97% capacity. Fighter wings are ready. Weapons are charged. Shields are at maximum. I have been reviewing our combat history. I think I remember how to do this. There was something in the AI's voice that Jake recognized. Eagerness mixed with nervousness. This AI had not fought a real battle in 70 years. She was worried about whether she could still do her job. "You are going to do fine," Jake said. "We are all going to do fine. We just need to remember what we are fighting for." The next 3 hours passed quickly. Jake spent the time reviewing tactical plans and studying the Varjesh fleet. Lauren sent him constant updates from the command center. The Varjesh were maintaining their course and speed. They showed no signs of caution or concern. They really did think this was going to be easy. Earth Defense's 12 active warships moved into position near Earth. They were modern vessels, sleek and fast, with the latest weapons and shields. They looked impressive. But 12 ships against 47 was still terrible odds. Battle Group Heritage waited in a different part of the orbital space, hidden behind Earth's moon. The Varjesh would not see them until it was too late. That was the plan anyway. Finally, the moment came. The Varjesh fleet reached Earth orbit. Jake watched them on the tactical screen. They moved in a tight formation, their biometallic hulls gleaming in the sunlight. They were impressive ships, he had to admit, larger than most human vessels and covered in organic-looking armor that seemed to shift and flow like liquid. A communication came from Earth Defense. It was Admiral Victor Carter. "Jake, they are in position. Are you ready?" "Battle Group Heritage is ready, Admiral. Good luck. We are counting on you." The Varjesh broadcast another message. War Master Krell's voice came through the speakers, arrogant and dismissive. "Humans of Earth, your time is up. We see your pathetic defense fleet, 12 ships against our 47. You could have surrendered with dignity. Now you will be crushed. Your museum ships watch from orbit like tombstones, a fitting monument to a dying species." Jake felt his jaw tight. He opened a channel to all ships in Battle Group Heritage. "You hear that, everyone? They think we are tombstones. Let us show them what happens when tombstones come to life. All ships prepare to engage. This is for Earth. This is for every crew member who ever served on your decks. This is for everyone who thought their sacrifice was forgotten. Show them we remember. Show them we honor those sacrifices by being ready when we are needed." The Varjesh opened fire on Earth Defense's fleet. Blue plasma bolts streaked through space. The 12 modern warships scattered and returned fire, their advanced weapons bright against the darkness. Jake gave the order. "All ships, come about. Attack formation. Let them see us." Battle Group Heritage emerged from behind the moon. 23 ships that the Varjesh had dismissed as relics and monuments. But these ships were moving now, their weapons powered up, their shields active. They accelerated toward the Varjesh fleet with purpose and precision. Jake saw the exact moment when the Varjesh realized what was happening. Their formation hesitated. Ships began turning to face the new threat. He could imagine the confusion on their bridge. The museum ships were supposed to be dead. They were supposed to be harmless, but they were very much alive. The Montana fired first. Her main batteries released a salvo of magnetic projectiles. Huge slugs of metal accelerated to tremendous speeds. 3 Varjesh cruisers that had been focused on Earth defense suddenly had to deal with incoming fire from a completely different direction. Their shields flared and failed. The Montana's weapons were old-fashioned, but they hit harder than anything the Varjesh had ever encountered. "Independence, launch fighters," Jake ordered. The carrier's launch bays opened and fighter craft poured out. 76 small vessels that looked outdated compared to modern fighters. But they moved with coordinated precision that spoke of extensive training and experience. Their AI pilots had been programmed by veterans of dozens of battles. They knew tricks and tactics that had been forgotten by younger pilots. The Varjesh fleet was now fighting on 2 fronts, Earth defense in front of them, Battle Group Heritage hitting them from the side, and 76 angry fighters swarming through their formation like hornets. Jake watched the battle unfold on the tactical screens. It was chaos, but it was controlled chaos. His ships knew what they were doing. They had been doing this for decades before they were retired. Now they were doing it again. A message came from the Varjesh fleet. War Master Krell's voice had lost its arrogance. Now he just sounded confused and angry. "What is this? Those ships were decommissioned. They should not be able to fight." Jake opened a return channel. "This is Captain Jake Sullivan of Battle Group Heritage. You made a mistake, War Master. You thought our museum was a sign of weakness. You thought keeping old ships meant we were living in the past. But we keep these ships because we learn from them. Every vessel in my command represents lessons learned in battle. Every one of them was retired because we built something better. But that does not mean they forgot how to fight." The destroyers Hartford and Phoenix executed a coordinated attack on a Varjesh battleship. They moved in perfect synchronization, the way they had moved together for 30 years of service. Their combined fire overwhelmed the battleship's shields and tore into its hull. The cruiser Seattle deployed electronic warfare systems that had not been used in combat for 40 years. The Varjesh had no defense against them because they had never encountered them before. Their communications network started breaking down. Ships lost contact with their command vessel and had to fight independently. And through it all, the little frigate Victory danced through the battlefield like a ghost. She was small and fast, and her AI core had more combat experience than any other ship present. She knew exactly where to be and when to be there. Her weapons might have been old, but she fired them with surgical precision, taking out engines and weapon systems with shots that seemed impossible. Jake felt pride swelling in his chest as he watched his ships fight. This was what they had been built for. This was what all those years of service had prepared them for. They were not just relics. They were warriors who had never forgotten their purpose. The Varjesh fleet was breaking apart. They had expected an easy victory against a weak enemy. Instead, they had run into a museum that fought back. Ships began breaking off and trying to retreat, but Battle Group Heritage was not letting them go easily. All ships maintain pressure, Jake ordered. Show them this is our home. Show them we defend it with everything we have. The battle raged on, and Jake knew that whatever happened next, the Varjesh would never again underestimate humanity. They had learned a hard lesson today. The past was not dead. It was very much alive, and it remembered how to fight. The first shots from the Varjesh fleet lit up space like angry stars. Jake Sullivan gripped the arms of his command chair aboard the Independence and watched the incoming fire on the tactical display. His heart pounded hard in his chest, but his voice stayed calm when he spoke into the communications system. All ships in the museum fleet received his orders at the same time. The battleship Montana moved forward first, placing her massive bulk between the smaller vessels and the enemy. Her shields glowed bright blue as the Varjesh weapons hit them. The old battleship shook from the impacts, but she held her position. Montana had been built during a time when ships were made to take damage and keep fighting. Her thick armor plating was outdated by modern standards, but it was exactly what they needed right now. Jake heard the Montana's artificial intelligence report through the fleet channel. The voice was calm and steady, just like the crews who had once served aboard her. Shield strength was dropping, but not as fast as the Varjesh probably expected. The old defensive systems were layered in ways that newer ships had abandoned in favor of lighter, faster designs. Sometimes the old ways worked better. Behind Montana, the cruisers Seattle and Denver moved into flanking positions. Their weapon systems came online with sounds that Jake remembered from his youth. These were not the quiet, efficient energy weapons of modern warships. These were magnetic accelerators, railguns that fired solid projectiles at incredible speeds. They made noise. They shook the ships when they fired, and they hit like hammers. The Seattle fired first. 3 rounds left her main batteries and crossed the distance to the Varjesh line in seconds. The enemy ships tried to dodge, but they were not fast enough. The projectiles punched through their shields and tore into their hulls. 2 Varjesh cruisers spun out of formation, trailing atmosphere and debris. The third took a glancing hit that knocked out half its weapons. Jake allowed himself a small smile. The Varjesh had studied humanity's recent wars, but they had not gone back far enough. Modern human ships used energy weapons almost exclusively. The old kinetic weapons were considered too slow, too heavy, and too difficult to maintain. But against enemies who designed their defenses for energy weapons, a simple chunk of metal moving at high speed was devastatingly effective. Lauren Burke's voice came through from the museum platform where she coordinated the battle. She sounded excited and scared at the same time. Jake remembered feeling that way during his first real combat many years ago. She reported that the destroyers Hartford and Phoenix were moving into attack position. The 2 sister ships had served together for 3 decades before being retired. Their artificial intelligence systems had developed what the technicians called a Gestalt partnership. They thought and fought as one unit. Jake gave them permission to proceed with their attack plan. He trusted their judgment. These ships had fought in the Outer Colonies War, where human forces were outnumbered 5-1. They had learned to survive by being unpredictable, by taking risks that seemed crazy but worked because the enemy never expected them. The Hartford and Phoenix accelerated away from the main formation, their engines burning bright. The Varjesh command ship noticed them and redirected fire toward the 2 destroyers. Jake watched anxiously as plasma bolts tracked toward his ships. But the destroyers were ready. They jinked and weaved through space, their courses seemingly random but actually following complex evasion patterns developed decades ago. Most of the Varjesh shots missed. The few that connected were absorbed by shields that had been carefully positioned to deflect rather than absorb the full impact. It was an old technique called angular shielding. Modern ships did not use it because it required too much coordination between the pilot and the shield operators. But these artificial intelligence systems had been doing it for so long that it was second nature to them. The two destroyers split apart as they approached the Varjesh formation. Hartford went high while Phoenix went low, forcing the enemy to divide their defensive fire. Then, at the exact same moment, both ships fired their missiles. Older models with chemical propulsion systems instead of the modern antimatter drives. The missiles were slower, easier to track, and the Varjesh point defense systems locked onto them immediately. But that was exactly what Jake had hoped would happen. While the Varjesh were busy shooting down missiles, they were not paying attention to the destroyers themselves. Hartford and Phoenix closed to knife fighting range and opened up with every weapon they had. Lasers, railguns, and even old-fashioned explosive shells tore into the Varjesh cruisers at point-blank range. 3 more enemy ships fell out of formation, badly damaged. One of them exploded in a brilliant flash that lit up Jake's viewscreen. The Varjesh were learning that humanity's museum ships were not helpless relics, but the battle was far from over. The Varjesh still had more than 40 ships, and they were adapting to human tactics. Their formation tightened up, with larger ships protecting smaller ones. Their fire became more concentrated and coordinated. Jake saw several shots impact the Montana's shields in the exact same spot, trying to create a weak point. He needed to change things up before the Varjesh could establish a rhythm. Jake pulled up the tactical files for the Independence. The old carrier had launched her fighters early in the battle, and they were still out there, engaging the enemy. 76 older model fighters against a modern fleet. On paper, it should have been a massacre. But the pilots, even though they were artificial intelligences, remembered things that modern pilots had forgotten. Jake opened the fighter command channel. He spoke directly to the squadron leaders, giving them an order that would have made modern tacticians shake their heads in disbelief. He told them to execute attack pattern Delta 9. It was a maneuver from the very early days of space combat, when fighters were new and nobody knew the best way to use them. The pattern involved the fighters grouping together into a tight formation and then charging straight at the enemy capital ships. It was considered suicidal by modern standards. Fighters were supposed to stay spread out, use hit-and-run tactics, never present a concentrated target. But Delta 9 worked on a different principle. It bet everything on speed and surprise. The fighters would bunch up so tightly that enemy sensors would have trouble tracking individual craft. Then they would punch through the defensive screen at maximum velocity, relying on speed rather than maneuverability to survive. The fighter squadrons acknowledged the order without hesitation. They had trained for Delta 9 before they were retired. Their programming included the maneuver even though it had not been used in actual combat for 50 years. Jake watched as the 76 fighters merged into 3 tight wedges and turned toward the Varjesh fleet. The Varjesh point defense opened fire immediately. Space filled with defensive fire, creating a wall of energy that looked impossible to penetrate. Jake held his breath as the fighter wedges plunged into that killing zone. Several fighters vanished from his tactical display, destroyed by the concentrated fire. But the rest kept going, moving so fast that the Varjesh targeting systems could not keep up. The 3 wedges broke apart at the last possible second, and suddenly 70 individual fighters were among the Varjesh capital ships. They were inside the defensive perimeter, too close for the big guns to track them. The fighters spread out and attacked everything they could reach. Engines, weapons, sensor arrays, anything that looked important became a target. The Varjesh formation fell into chaos. Ships collided as they tried to maneuver in close quarters. Some of them fired at the fighters and hit their own vessels instead. The careful coordination they had been building fell apart in minutes. Jake seized the opportunity. He ordered the Montana to advance, bringing the heavy battleship's weapons to bear on the confused enemy. The Seattle and Denver followed, their railguns firing steadily. The Hartford and Phoenix rejoined the formation, their ammunition depleted but their spirits high. Every ship in the museum fleet pushed forward, pressing the attack while the Varjesh were still reeling. But Jake had not forgotten about his secret weapon. The frigate Victory had been holding back, waiting for the right moment. She was the oldest ship in the fleet, nearly 80 years old. Her weapons were primitive compared to everything else out there. Her shields were weak. Her armor was thin. By every measure, she should have been the first ship to die in this battle. But Victory had something that numbers could not measure. She had experience. Her artificial intelligence had fought in more battles than any other system in the human fleet. She had survived situations that destroyed newer, stronger ships. She knew tricks and techniques that existed nowhere except in her memory cores. Jake gave her the order she had been waiting for. Victory accelerated toward the Varjesh command ship. She was small enough and old enough that the enemy dismissed her as a threat. Their sensors were focused on the Montana and the cruisers, the ships that could actually hurt them. They did not waste firepower on an ancient frigate that looked like it might fall apart if someone sneezed at it. That mistake would cost them the battle. Victory slipped through the Varjesh defensive line like a ghost. Her small size and outdated engine signature made her almost invisible among all the debris and weapons fire. By the time the Varjesh noticed her, she was already at point-blank range with their flagship. The frigate opened fire with everything she had. Her weapons were old-fashioned explosive shells and short-range lasers, the kind that modern ships did not even bother to install anymore. But at this range, against a ship that had not expected to be attacked, they were devastatingly effective. Victory's shells punched through the flagship's shields and detonated inside the hull. Each explosion was small by the standards of modern warfare, but they hit critical systems. Communications arrays went dark. Sensor clusters shattered. Weapon mounts exploded. The Varjesh command ship shuddered under the assault, her tough biometallic armor cracking under impacts it had never been designed to withstand. Inside the Varjesh flagship, Warmaster Krell felt his ship dying beneath him. Alarms screamed from every console. His crew members were shouting reports, but the communications system kept cutting out. He could not coordinate his fleet. He could not even see what was happening to his other ships. His tactical officer managed to get one screen working. It showed the human museum fleet advancing in perfect formation, their weapons firing steadily, their movements coordinated despite being ships from different eras with different capabilities. They fought like a unit that had trained together for years, not a collection of retired vessels pulled from storage. Krell realized his terrible mistake. He had assumed the humans kept these ships in a museum because they were weak, because they clung to past glories instead of building new strength. But the truth was exactly the opposite. Humans kept these ships as a library, a repository of every lesson they had learned in centuries of warfare. Each vessel represented a different approach to combat, a different solution to the problems of survival in space. The Varjesh had conquered 27 systems in the past decade. They had crushed enemies with superior technology and overwhelming force. But they had never faced an opponent who could draw on hundreds of years of accumulated tactical knowledge, who could switch between modern and ancient warfare techniques without hesitation, who treated their history not as something dead but as something alive and useful. Another explosion rocked the flagship. Krell made his decision. Pride and conquest were meaningless if he did not survive to see another day. He ordered his fleet to retreat. The order went out through what remained of his communications system, and the Varjesh ships began to pull back. Jake watched the enemy fleet breaking apart and fleeing. He felt a surge of relief mixed with pride. The museum ships had done it. They had defended Earth against a modern invasion force. But he did not let his emotions show in his voice when he gave the next order. All ships were to hold position and let the Varjesh go. This battle was won, and there was no need for unnecessary killing. The Independence's bridge was quiet as they watched the Varjesh disappear into the distance. Around the carrier, the other museum ships began to form up for the return to their stations. The Montana's shields were nearly depleted, and her hull showed scorch marks from dozens of impacts. The Seattle had lost one of her main guns. The Phoenix had taken damage to her engines. But they were all intact, all functional, all ready to fight again if needed. Lauren's voice came through from the museum platform. She sounded amazed and exhausted at the same time. She reported that all 23 ships were accounted for. They had lost 14 fighters during the battle, but the pilots had been artificial intelligences that could be restored from backups. No human lives were lost. Against 47 Varjesh warships, that was nothing short of miraculous. Admiral Victor Carter contacted Jake from Earth Defense Command. His face on the screen showed relief and something that might have been tears. He had known these ships when they were active, had served on some of them during his own career. Seeing them fight again, seeing them win, meant more to him than Jake could properly understand. Victor told Jake that governments across Earth were already receiving reports of the battle. The news was spreading through human space at incredible speed. The museum that everyone thought was just a tourist attraction had saved the planet. People who had visited those ships, who had walked their decks and touched their hulls, now knew that they had been standing inside actual weapons of war, not just monuments to past glories. But Victor also had a warning. The Varjesh would not forget this defeat. They might come back with more ships, better prepared for human tactics. The museum fleet had won this battle through surprise as much as skill. Next time the enemy would know what they were facing. Jake nodded, but he was not worried. If the Varjesh came back, they would be facing not just 23 old ships, but an entire civilization that understood the value of remembering how to fight. Every human child who visited the museum would learn the lesson that had just been taught. History was not something to put on a shelf and forget. History was a weapon, a tool, a guide for the future. The fleet made its way back to the museum platform slowly. The ships that had been so still and silent for so many years now moved with purpose and pride. Their weapons were powering down, their shields dropping to standby levels, but everyone who saw them knew they were still dangerous. Jake stood on the bridge of the Independence and watched the planet Earth grow larger in the view screen. He thought about all the people down there who did not know how close they had come to invasion and conquest. The Varjesh had been confident, had believed their intelligence reports that said humanity was weak and divided. They had seen the museum and thought it proved humans lived in the past, but the truth was that humans lived in all times at once. They remembered the past, worked in the present, and planned for the future. Every generation built on what came before, learning from mistakes and preserving victories. The museum was not a monument to dead warriors. It was a promise to future generations that they would never have to face any challenge alone, that they would always have the wisdom of the past to guide them. As the ships settled back into their display positions around the museum platform, Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of him wanted these ships to stay active, to rejoin the regular fleet. They had proven they could still fight, still contribute, still defend humanity against its enemies. But another part of him understood that their role as museum pieces was just as important, maybe more important. Active warships fought battles, but these ships taught lessons. They showed people what their ancestors had accomplished, what challenges they had overcome, what techniques they had developed. Every school child who toured these vessels learned something about courage, innovation, and survival. Lauren met Jake at the airlock when he returned to the museum platform. She had been watching the battle from the command center, coordinating information between the ships and Earth defense. Her face was pale from stress, but her eyes were bright with excitement. She told Jake that they were already receiving requests from other museums across human space. Everyone wanted to know if their collections could be upgraded the same way. Could old ships in other systems be restored to fighting condition while still serving as educational exhibits? Could every museum become a hidden fortress, ready to defend its home in times of crisis? Jake smiled at the thought. It made sense in a way that was very human. Why let old ships rust in storage when they could serve two purposes? They could teach people about history during peacetime and defend them during war. Every museum could become what this one had been, a repository of knowledge and power combined. But he also cautioned Lauren not to get too carried away. Success of this battle came from surprise. The Varjesh had not expected these ships to fight. Next time, Any enemy would know to take museum fleets seriously. The advantage of surprise would be gone. Lauren nodded, but she pointed out something Jake had not considered. Even if enemies knew about the museum ships, they would still have to deal with the problem of fighting vessels that span decades of tactical development. How do you prepare for an opponent who might use tactics from 7 different eras? How do you defend against weapons that range from cutting edge to nearly obsolete? The variety itself was a weapon. Jake had to admit she had a point. Modern warfare had become standardized in many ways. Most species used similar weapons, similar shields, similar tactics. Combat had patterns that commanders could study and prepare for. But humanity's museum fleet threw all those patterns out the window. Every ship fought differently, using techniques from different periods, forcing the enemy to constantly adapt. Over the next few days, Jake and Lauren worked to assess the damage and begin repairs. Most of the ships needed relatively minor fixes. The Montana's shields had to be replaced completely, but her hull and weapons were fine. The Seattle needed a new main gun, which would take some time to fabricate. The Phoenix's engines required extensive work, but nothing that could not be done with the museum's facilities. The real surprise came from the ships themselves. Their artificial intelligence cores, which had been dormant for so long, seemed almost happy to be awake and active again. They communicated with the repair crews, suggesting improvements based on their combat experience. The Montana's AI recommended strengthening certain armor sections that had taken heavy fire. The Victory's AI had ideas about upgrading her targeting systems while preserving her unique combat style. Jake found himself consulting with the AIs more and more, treating them as the experienced officers they effectively were. It was strange to take advice from computer systems, but these were not ordinary computers. They contained the accumulated knowledge of every crew that had served aboard their ships. They had learned and adapted through decades of service. In some ways, they were more qualified to give tactical advice than any living human. News of the battle continued to spread through human space and beyond. Other species began to reassess their understanding of humanity. The peaceful, museum-building race that everyone thought they knew suddenly looked much more dangerous. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy started asking questions. How many museum ships did humans have? Were all of them secretly combat-ready? What other hidden capabilities might humanity possess? The Varjesh Collective sent a formal communication 2 weeks after the battle. It was not exactly an apology, but it acknowledged that they had made errors in their assessment of human military capabilities. They requested a ceasefire and negotiations. They wanted to understand humans better before making any further decisions about conflict. Jake read the communication with satisfaction. The battle had achieved something beyond just defending Earth. It had changed how other species saw humanity. Humans were no longer just the peaceful builders and explorers. They were survivors who remembered every lesson, who kept their weapons sharp even in times of peace, who could pull victory from the past when needed. Admiral Victor came to visit the museum platform a month after the battle. He walked the decks of the Independence with Jake, remembering his own service aboard her predecessor many years ago. They stood together in the fighter bay, where 76 small craft were being restored after their dangerous attack run. Victor told Jake that Earth's government was debating what to do about the museum fleet. Some politicians wanted to recommission the ships officially, bring them back into active service. Others argued they should remain as they were, a hidden reserve ready for emergencies. A few suggested building new museums with new collections, expanding the concept to create a network of defensive installations disguised as historical sites. Jake had his own opinion. He thought the ships should stay exactly where they were, doing exactly what they had been doing. They were more valuable as museums than as active warships. Every ship in the current fleet was newer, faster, stronger than these old vessels, but none of them could teach the way these ships could. Children who toured the museum now knew they were walking through real warships that had just defended Earth. They would remember these ships, remember their stories, remember the lessons they taught. Some of those children would grow up to be engineers who designed better ships. Some would become tacticians who developed new strategies. Some would become historians who preserved the knowledge for future generations. That was the real power of the museum. Not the weapons, not the shields, not the ability to fight when needed. The real power was in the teaching, the remembering, the passing down of knowledge from one generation to the next. As long as humans remembered how their ancestors fought and survived, they would never truly be helpless. Lauren started giving new tour, her presentations changed by what she had experienced. She no longer talked about the ships as if they were dead things. She described them as sleeping guardians, resting but ready, waiting patiently for the day when they might be needed again. The visitors loved it. School groups, military officers, tourists from other worlds, they all listened with fascination to stories of ships that had come alive when Earth was threatened. Jake found himself becoming something of a celebrity. People wanted to interview him, to hear about the battle from his perspective. He did a few interviews but kept them brief and factual. He did not want the focus on himself. The real heroes were the ships and the people who had built them, maintained them, and preserved them through all the years of peace. One afternoon, Jake stood alone on the observation deck, looking at his collection with new eyes. The Montana floated majestically in her display position, her battle scars now badges of honor. The Victory hung near the edge of the formation, small and old but proven deadly when needed. The Independence spread her wings behind him, her massive bulk a reminder that size and age could still mean power. He thought about what these ships represented. They were not just weapons. They were proof that humanity learned from experience, that they valued their history, that they understood the connection between past and future. Every ship had a story. Every story taught a lesson. Every lesson made humans stronger. The Varjesh had seen the museum and thought it showed weakness. They thought humans who celebrated old ships were living in the past, unable to move forward, clinging to dead glories. But they had been completely wrong. Humans who remembered their history were not weak. They were the strongest of all because they carried the wisdom of every previous generation into every new challenge. Jake knew that someday, maybe soon or maybe far in the future, these ships might have to fight again. New enemies would arise, new threats would emerge, new challenges would demand new responses. But he was not worried. The museum fleet would be ready. They would always be ready. That was their promise, their purpose, their reason for existing. As he watched the ships floating in their eternal vigil, Jake understood something important. Museums were not graveyards where dead things were stored. They were armories where knowledge was kept sharp and ready. They were schools where every visitor learned something valuable. They were fortresses that looked peaceful but could roar to life when needed. And most of all, they were promises. Promises that humanity would never forget where they came from, what they had overcome, or how they had survived. Promises that the lessons of the past would guide the future. Promises that no enemy who underestimated humanity because of their respect for history would ever make that mistake again. The museum ships floated in silence once more, their weapons powered down, their systems in standby mode. To a casual observer, they looked like harmless relics again. But everyone who knew their secret understood the truth. They were sleeping, not dead, resting, not retired, waiting patiently for the next time Earth needed heroes from the past to defend the present. And they would wait as long as necessary, because that was what museum ships did. They preserved the past, taught the present, and stood ready for the future, all at the same time.